In this lecture, I want to spend just a few moments talking about the use of the concept of nonviolence and civil disobedience in the philosophies of Mahatma Gandhi and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Simply, both Gandhi and King are inspired by, for Gandhi, the Hindu concept of ahimsa, and for King, that same concept in Gandhi from ancient Hindu religion, which he also identifies in Jesus. To make a complex and profound idea very simple, it's easy enough for us to use violence to counter violence. And countering violence with nonviolence is certainly hard. And probably not always likely to be successful. However, in some very big and historically noteworthy ways, nonviolence has been successful. Gandhi uses nonviolence and civil disobedience to essentially overthrow British colonial rule of India. It's remarkable in its efficacy. Think of how entrenched Southern and American racism, segregation, and discrimination and prejudice was thoroughly entrenched in American society. And Martin Luther King is able to overthrow this through nonviolence and civil disobedience during the era of civil rights. I have a hard time putting myself in the shoes of someone in 1950s, looking at how thoroughly entrenched racism was, and imagining that significant progress could be made through nonviolence. For Dr. King, the moral superiority, the moral high ground it provided was sufficient to achieve, to a significant extent, his ideals. People often give the counter-argument, well, what about World War II? Nonviolence wouldn't have stopped the Holocaust. I'm willing to say that's true. However, we can't just forget about nonviolence. Not that we shouldn't. Certainly we shouldn't. But we can't remove it from the table as an option. Because in some remarkable ways, nonviolence has been extraordinarily successful. If we overlook nonviolence as a solution, we're overlooking something of historical relevance that has worked. It's not just theoretical, it's practical. And that's worth remembering, that nonviolence is literally always an option at least to consider. But once we have those ideas, I'll leave it to you to spend time reading through and getting a feel for Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail and the issues of racism and equality he addresses there. Instead, what I'm going to focus our time on is literally a type of Marxist analysis. The analysis I'm about to provide is inspired by something in Marx's Communist Manifesto. Specifically, Marx's idea that exploitation, oppression, and repression, and most broadly, income inequality, which he's interested in countering, can be significantly reduced, in his argument, if we take away the right of inheritance. This has an interesting implication. Marx's point is that money is passed down from generation to generation. Wealth, as a form of inheritance, creates a structural inequality that Marx desires to counteract. Regardless of his arguments about inheritance and what should be done about it, let's understand what inheritance makes possible, and specifically makes possible in the context of the legacy of slavery and the injustices that are created as a result of that legacy of slavery. What you see before you now is a side-by-side comparison going down through time of who has the wealth in American society, especially from the 1850s to today. What I have analyzed is that in 1850, practically to effectively 0% of the people who are wealthy are people who are black. And effectively, 100% of the people who are wealthy are white. That's not to say all whites are wealthy, or that all blacks are poor, at that time even. But when we look at the racial composition of the affluent class, in Marx's terms, the bourgeoisie, the owners are a racialized segment. Literally, the people owned are also owned on racial qualities. Now, as we go down to the 1950s, just a generation or two later, those wealthy individuals passed down their wealth in the form of property and just simple money. And those populations who had no wealth nor access to wealth have nothing to pass down. Now, perhaps if we analyze the number of people in the class of people that are wealthy according to their race, perhaps by the 1900s, 1% of the wealthy are black. But that's probably an enormous overestimate. And the reasons why are that this is still the era of Jim Crow, black codes, of lynching, and official segregation. Notice that never giving 40 acres and a mule after slavery meant that we have what is usually called landed gentry, which is white, that the people who are wealthy are white because they have property. And if the freed slaves are never provided property, they're starting from zero. Whereas at least those who end up being in the affluent class don't start from zero. Again, not to say there are not poor white people. Certainly there are. But of the people who are rich, they are significantly white. As we move forward, just a generation or two into the 1950s, which is still before the era of civil rights, maybe that portion of the wealthy class who is black is doubling, twice as much, every generation. But still, there's an incredible inequality that can be traced back to institutional racism as a legacy of slavery and a legacy injustice of slavery. If we look at the people who are wealthy, affluent, you can take a look at in the 1950s what the racial composition of that class is. And likely 2% is still an enormous over-exaggeration. So that as we get down just 2 generations further still, where we are now, 30 years into a racially disparate war on drugs, which is to say that although blacks and whites use and sell drugs at nearly the same rate, black people and brown people, like Latinos, are targeted for enforcement and sentenced much more harshly than whites are. A sort of unofficial but de facto institutional racism. Would it be reasonable for us to assume that these 2 classes, or that these 2 racialized groups in the class of people that are wealthy have evened out? I don't think so. Now, what I'm arguing here is not that 50% of people who are wealthy should be black. Though we certainly could. There's nothing wrong with that argument. But rather that we do have racial disparity still. To suppose that we live in a post-racial society or a post-racism society would be wildly naive. Not only are people who experienced lynchings, people who participated in doing the lynchings, still literally alive. The effects are intergenerational of slavery and of the impact that had on who is well off and who is not well off. I present this, among other things, to understand our society, to understand that slavery isn't something black people should just get over, because its effects are still felt. This is an argument in favor of what has been affirmative action, that there should be conscious policies to make up for a long history of discrimination, the effects of which carry on down through the generations to today. So that even though we may not personally be responsible for slavery, we benefit from the history of slavery. And by we, I mean people who were not enslaved. And people whose ancestors were enslaved still can be and are negatively affected by the legacy injustices of those historical circumstances. Now, it's not just enslavement and the lack of property, affluence, and wealth that is at issue, but also the complete and total destruction or annihilation of black and African culture that slavery represents. It's not hard to imagine why African American youth might not find everything of value in American school for those that don't. If what we teach is white history, white supremacy, and white culture, we're not teaching black history, black civilization, and black culture. We're not teaching them, we're teaching us to them. That's me, your teacher, spoken as a white man. if they don't have their culture, and have literally had to recreate a new culture in this land because their culture, their connection to their roots, their ancestry, their spirituality, their people, their history, has been actively destroyed for hundreds of years. That is a significant disadvantage. Those are the reasons why people have argued for giving a racial leg up in order to counterbalance the negative effect of the overwhelming racist history of the United States of America, which is a judgment that is obviously true. At a time when Donald Trump's father was buying up property in New York, property which then gave him the money to run for president and be successful. It was still a time when black people were literally and legally discriminated against in all sorts of forms and just outright murdered by racist Ku Klux Klan lynch mobs across the South and across the U.S. There is good reason to believe that even the war on drugs has a significantly racial component. If you study the first head of the DEA, a man by the last name Anslinger, he identifies marijuana as especially a concern, testifying to Congress that marijuana made people more criminal, and especially was bad because it made black people think they could act like white people. The word generally used for that is uppity. Richard Nixon, in the 1970s, had an aide by the name of Ehrlichman, Ehrlichmann, who reports that the purpose of the drug war and the tough on crime, war on drugs, policies of the 1970s going forward were specifically to target Nixon's political enemies, hippies and blacks who were against the Vietnam War. Nixon and his aides could identify blacks and hippies with marijuana, criminalize marijuana, and effectively silence a significant portion to the opposition to the war they desired. After all, it was more likely to be the African Americans going off to fight the war than people who could avoid the war draft dodging through various social benefits they might have, such as playing for college basketball teams while claiming they had bone spurs that prevented them from serving. Why wouldn't the African Americans of the 1970s want to go to the Vietnam War? It wasn't their war. What beef did they have with the Viet Cong? So that as we get down to today, the significantly and more often than not explicitly institutionalized racism that has characterized American politics, American legal system, the American justice system, and American society and culture at large, results in structural inequality. And so the question is, what do we do about it? Affirmative action is one solution. There are these things in contemporary justice theory you'll see in the next video, called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, likely justice system reform, which is not even to mention the effect of never providing the 40 acres originally people thought former slaves were due. Understand the economic value of 40 acres. Those who have land and have wealth can pass on that land and that wealth. Those who were shut out of it, according to various means, lynch mobs not excluded, don't have access to that wealth, and don't have access to that wealth to pass down to the next generation. So that the effects of slavery are still among us today. The injustice has a legacy, like a half-life. It goes away a little bit over time, but it remains for far longer than we might expect it to. Perhaps you'd be tempted to argue that if a person works really hard, they can move up the social ladder. We can have social mobility. It's the American dream. Work hard and you can get rich. But what sociologists find when they study this is that even for white youth, a white youth born into a family in poverty has something like a 5% chance of moving into the middle or affluent class. That's 1 in 20. For inner city youth, the number goes down to a 1 to 2% chance that they will, if born into poverty, rise out of poverty. Now, that crosses the boundary into a type of social and economic determinism. But there's more than a significant possibility that the American dream is dream because it's not reality. That's a myth propagated to serve certain, likely bourgeois interests. But once we realize what the situation is, only then, now that we accurately see what the dynamics are, can we more adequately be able to address the issues once we see them clearly, than if we turn a blind eye to the half-life or legacy injustice of things that are now historical, but whose effects are still felt down to today.